episode 207 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we walk you through the Epicurean texts, and we discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at epicureanfriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. We are in Book 2 of Cicero's On Ends, where Cicero has taken the platform from Torquatus, and Cicero is now launching off into a full attack on Epicurean philosophy. For the last 2 weeks or so, we've been discussing the nature of morality. And at the beginning of section 16, Cicero had pointed out to Torquatus that Epicurus embraced virtue. And then after attempting to pin Torquatus to this position where, well, you too, Torquatus, are accepting the grandeur of virtue, Cicero is now going to switch over and allege that, having acknowledged to me, Torquatus, that you yourself see the grandeur of virtue, don't you see the decadence of putting pleasure in the heart of ethics as opposed to virtue? And so now Cicero is going to turn to talking about a number of famous Roman examples of lack of morality from Cicero's point of view. So today we're going to be going through, the first of these is someone named Lucius Tubulus, but there are others as well. And this is not the Roman history podcast, and none of us here are able to, with a great deal of detail, to go into the specifics of the histories of these people who are mentioned. But I think that Cicero gives us enough here to understand the point that he's making. The first example that Cicero gives is Lucius Tubulus. He, having presided as praetor over the court for trying murderers, took bribes with such openness that in the following year Publius Scaevola, the tribune of the commons, carried a bill in the popular assembly directing an inquiry to be made into the matter. Under this bill, the Senate voted that the inquiry should be conducted by Gnaeus Caepio, the consul. Tubulus went into exile at once and did not venture to defend himself. The facts were indeed evident. The only thing that's probably important about that little story there is that Lucius Tubulus was such an openly, I think the word people use today is grifting. He's such an open grifter, an openly corrupt person, that when he was replaced in office, it was obvious to the people who came behind him that he had been stealing from the public, and that Tubulus was so aware of the openness of what he had been doing that he just simply went into exile and didn't even try to defend himself. The facts were so evident. And by bringing up that example, Cicero is setting the stage here to get us back into the Epicurean position about the man who can hope reasonably to escape punishment for his wrongdoing. Because Epicurus is recorded to have said that it's not particularly an easy question to know what the wise man is going to do when the action that's being complained of is going to be totally unknown to other people. Because, of course, in placing pleasure and pain at the center of your moral analysis, it's the punishment that you can expect to receive for wrongdoing that is the ultimate reason why you don't do it. The punishment, both external from other people who are injured by your actions, as well as the punishment that you inflict on yourself in terms of a bad conscience and fear of being punished at some point. An example is given that throughout your whole life, you can't be totally certain that your iniquity won't be detected and you won't be punished for it. So, as we know, Epicurus focuses on the pain and punishment part of the reason not to do things that are considered to be unjust or iniquitous. So this first example that Cicero has given is someone whose iniquities were known to the people. Lucius Tubulus had committed his crimes so much in the public view that the evidence against him was so strong that he didn't even try to defend himself and went into exile. The more difficult question that Cicero is going to turn to next is, as Cicero says here at the beginning of 17, we're inquiring then not merely about an unprincipled man, but about one who is both crafty and unprincipled. And then he's going to give another example of Quintus Pompeius. But again, the setup for today is Cicero is complaining that Epicureans, because they don't have this absolute morality that he suggests they should have, are just totally depraved human beings who can't be counted on to do anything other than to commit crimes willy-nilly whenever they get the opportunity.
Yeah, it's a great problem here in Cicero, this issue as to Epicurus's opinion on these matters, in part because of what I quoted from Mary Porter Packer's article last week, Cassius, when she said that in this whole text here in Book 2, Cicero never engages with Epicurus's central claim about justice. Cicero never gives Epicurus's opinion on this or allows Torquatus to do so. And the opinion is this, that justice arises naturally between people when they make covenants for mutual advantage, neither to harm nor to be harmed. And so the point there from Epicurus's point of view is that, I can't control Lucius Publius, whatever that guy's name is, Tubulus morality, or whether he's going to take bribes. The authority of people living and working together to come together to make laws is justified under Epicurean philosophy. That's the nature of justice under Epicurean philosophy. Now, Cicero seems to be making a separate point, which is that Epicurean morality, which is a separate thing, allows Lucius Tubulus to get away with this, that as long as you won't be caught, then you're fine. Then you will escape punishment. There's no punishment after death, so there's nothing to worry about. But the question for the rest of us, really, when it comes to the Lucius Tubulus of the world, I don't know what it is about that name. The question for the rest of us, when it comes to the Lucius Tubuluses of the world, is not what his philosophy should tell him to do as to the nature of morality. It's how should we respond to that, given our understanding of justice. I think that's where the conversation needs to take place. And it's totally absent in this entire book. Cicero does not include Epicurus's understanding of justice as covenants based on mutual advantage, neither to harm nor to be harmed. And stealing from the public treasury or whatever his crime was there would certainly be included in that. That's going to be a problem in this whole text here, is that Cicero has not taken that into account. Before the recording, Cassius, we were talking about Thomas More's Utopia, in part because in that book, he gives a sort of imaginary fictional world in North America or South America in a place called Utopus that he uses as a sort of thought experiment to work out some of the conclusions of Epicurean philosophy. Thomas More was very, very Catholic here, and he does not, would not want necessarily these laws to be enacted in Europe. But Europe was having problems. The Catholic Church no longer had the iron grasp on European affairs that it had once enjoyed. Protestantism was the sort of new kid on the block. Northern Europe was totally falling under its sway. And what you have as a consequence of that is the mutual excommunications and the heresy hunting and the wars of religion and so forth. And Thomas More, his world is sort of collapsing around him. And he's looking for a solution to this problem. And he's looking for it casting a rather wide net here. Now, we know that Thomas More was friends with Erasmus, and they both shared a love, particularly for the literature of Lucian of Samosata, the satires of Lucian. And one of those satires has to do with Epicurean philosophy and how it responds to a religious, amoral charlatan, I guess is the word I could use. So this is what Thomas More writes in his book, Utopia. He says, as to moral philosophy, they, the utopians, have the same disputes among them as we have here. They examine what are properly good, both for the body and the mind, and whether any outward thing can be called truly good, or if that term belong only to the endowments of the soul. There's a bit of Aristotle in there, isn't there? The endowments of nature and so forth. They inquire likewise into the nature of virtue and pleasure, but their chief dispute is concerning the happiness of a man, and wherein it consists, whether in some one thing or in a great many. They seem indeed more inclinable to that opinion that places, if not the whole, yet the chief part of a man's happiness in pleasure. And what may seem more strange, they make use of arguments even from religion, notwithstanding its severity and roughness, for the support of that opinion so indulgent to pleasure. For they never dispute concerning happiness without fetching some arguments from the principles of religion as well as from natural reason, since without the former they reckon that all our inquiries after happiness must be but conjectural and defective. He says, and from thence they infer that if a man ought to advance the welfare and comfort of the rest of mankind, there being no virtue more proper and peculiar to our nature than to ease the miseries of others, to free from trouble and anxiety in furnishing them with the comforts of life, in which pleasure consists, nature much more vigorously leads them to do all this for himself, right? The pursuit of pleasure can be generalized to mankind, but it starts with yourself. It starts at home. A life of pleasure is either a real evil, and in that case, we ought not to assist others in their pursuit of it, but on the contrary, to keep them from it all we can, as from that which is most hurtful and deadly. Or if it is a good thing, so that we not only may, but ought to help others to it, why then ought not a man to begin with himself? Thus, as they define virtue to be living according to nature, so they imagine that nature prompts all people on to seek after pleasure as the end of all they do. He continues here, he says, they think it is an evidence of true wisdom for a man to pursue his own advantage as far as the laws allow it. They account it piety to prefer the public good to one's private concerns, but they think it unjust for a man to seek for pleasure by snatching another man's pleasure away from him. And on the contrary, they think it a sign of a gentle and good soul for a man to dispense with his own advantage for the good of others, and that by this means a good man finds as much pleasure one way as he parts with another. But of course, Thomas More is never going to go as far as Epicurus is willing to go. He says, to cap it all off, Utopus, the king of Utopia, made a solemn and severe law against such as should so far degenerate from the dignity of human nature as to think that our souls died with our body, or that the world was governed by chance without a wise overruling providence. For they all formerly believed that there was a state of rewards and punishments to the good and bad after this life, and they now look on those that think otherwise as scarce fit to be counted men, since they degrade so noble a being as the soul, and reckon it no better than a beast's. Thus they are far from looking on such men as fit for human society, or to be citizens of a well-ordered commonwealth, since a man of such principles must needs, as often as he dares do it, despise all their laws and customs. For there is no doubt to be made that a man who is afraid of nothing but the law and apprehends nothing after death will not scruple to break through all the laws of his country, either by fraud or force, when by this means he may satisfy his appetites. So we started out pretty good there in this book, Utopia, but in the end, Thomas More is very clear on his opinion. And it's an opinion that echoes that of John Locke. John Locke, in his letter concerning toleration, wrote that all the life and power of true religion consists in the inward and full persuasion of the soul, and that faith is not faith without believing. He said, I may grow rich by an art that I take not delight in. I may be cured by a remedy that I have no faith in, but I cannot be saved by a religion I distrust or by a worship that I abhor. So that sounds quite good. But then he himself goes on to say, those are not at all to be tolerated who deny the being of a God, for promises, covenants, and oaths can have no hold upon an atheist. That seems to be Cicero's main problem here. The Epicureans are heedless pursuers of pleasure, and not only that, they have no fear of the gods, and they have no fear of death to dissuade them from any crime they might commit. And this is Cicero's great problem. And so the question is, how do we answer that question? And that's kind of the focus, I think, of today, is what we're going to be doing this week, is trying to find an answer to that question.
Yes, I think that's a great summary of the problem. And so we see how the problem continues, the concern continues forever, it seems like. Cicero 2,000 years ago, these people you've just been quoting are much more recent. But we see the same argument out there today implicitly in common culture, that if you're pursuing pleasure, if you're just pursuing your own happiness, what is to restrain such a person from deciding that his happiness is to be a monster and to kill everyone else? What is to restrain such a person to stay within the bounds of common society that we value so much? And to bring this back to this section 16, one of the answers that Epicurus gives, as you were saying, Epicurus focuses justice on pleasure and pain. and how it is a natural development of humanity that you're going to come to terms with other people. You're going to form implicit or explicit contracts with other people to not be harmed in exchange for not harming them. You have the emergence of what amounts to a moral code of conduct through the natural interactions of people working together and seeing that if they don't come to terms with each other, then they're left with nothing but force. And Epicurus recognizes that that's what's going to happen. In certain circumstances, people who can't or don't agree to make these contracts, there is no justice involved, and they are left in that state where force is going to resolve the question, if it's going to be resolved at all. But the course that is in fact seen to maximize the pleasure and minimize the pain, not only for the majority of people, but for you yourself, in general, that course is to come to terms with other people and live benevolently with them for the mutual benefit of everyone involved in that relationship. And so where Cicero perceives a weak point in Epicurean philosophy here is he cannot imagine Epicureans acting morally without reference to a god or to virtue. And so to drop back for just a minute to something Cicero said in section 16, Cicero looks at Torquatus and says, Torquatus, indeed, the arguments you alleged were insignificant and weak. I mean that unprincipled men are tortured by their own consciousness within them and by fear of punishment, which they either suffer or live in dread of suffering at some time. So Cicero is referring back to what Torquatus has said. Torquatus has said, Epicurus has held that men are generally going to act properly because they fear punishment. And Cicero says that's a weak and insignificant argument, Torquatus, because don't you know that people don't all act that way? You shouldn't consider your bad man to be, as Cicero says here, a coward or a weakling, torturing himself about what he's done and frightened at everything. What you don't understand, Torquatus, is that there are people out there who are craftily judging everything by their interests, people who are keen, shrewd, and hardened, so that they readily devise means for cheating without detection, without witnesses, and without any accomplices. So he's saying to Torquatus, your argument is bogus, Torquatus. Forget about conscience as a restraint on action, because lots of people get away with their crimes without ever being punished, without ever having any witnesses. And so your whole argument, Torquatus, is ridiculous. And that's where we come up with the example of Lucius Tubulus as someone who was willing to just commit his crimes totally out in the open, because there are people who are so depraved that they're willing to do that. It recalls to my mind that back in Book 1, Torquatus had used the phrase that there are certain men who are so depraved that they're proper to be restrained rather than reformed. Epicurus knew that, just as it says in the Principal Doctrines, that not everyone is going to form those agreements with each other. And in fact, there are going to be situations where your crimes are not going to be easily exposed. So how do we deal with the fact that some people may get away with their crimes? What's the possible answers to, okay, Torquatus, your philosophy is so unsound, you're not providing a way to punish people who do bad things. And so therefore, people who do bad things in your philosophy just may prosper. How terrible is that, Torquatus? How can you live with that? So we have to think about what answers Torquatus and the Epicureans would give. And one of the answers I think they would give is that while that may be true, Cicero, sometimes bad people do prosper. Does that mean we should just give up all rationality in connection with nature and just develop a fantasy, a noble lie like Plato? Are we going to give up our hold on honesty and clarity and reality about the way the universe operates just because there are some bad results that happen? There's a saying in the law that hard cases make bad law. Well, are you going to look at the bad person out there who happens to escape punishment and say that, well, because he escaped punishment, I'm going to jettison everything I know about nature and the world and reality, and I'm going to harness myself to some fictional god who's going to tell everybody what to do? Is that the right answer, Cicero? I think Torquatus would say, no, that's not the right answer. We have another example of that in the Epicurean text that's very interestingly written from Diogenes of Oinoander and the wall that he erected. One of the fragments that talks about this issue of justice is fragment number 20, which is translated by Martin Ferguson Smith in the way I'm going to quote right now. Fragment 20 from Diogenes of Oinoander says, "So it's obvious that wrongdoers, given that they do not fear the penalties imposed by the laws, are not afraid of the gods. This has to be conceded, for if they were afraid, they would not do wrong. As for all the others, it is my opinion that the wise are not righteous on account of the gods, but on account of thinking correctly, and the opinions they hold regarding certain things, especially pain and death. For indeed, invariably and without exception, human beings do wrong either on account of fear or on account of pleasure. And that ordinary people, on the other hand, are righteous insofar as they are righteous on account of the laws and the penalties imposed by the laws hanging over them." And then he goes on to say that a clear indication of the complete inability of the gods to prevent wrongdoing is provided by examples that he gives here of nations who are very superstitious and religious, but are also vile. And so he continues on and says, on account of what kind of gods then will human beings be righteous? For they're not righteous on account of the real gods or on account of Plato's or Socrates as judges in Hades. We are left with this conclusion: why should not those who disregard the laws scorn fables much more? In other words, there he's saying there's people out there who are disregarding the law now, even the obvious punishment that they could get from the police or from the military, depending on what they're doing that's wrong. They disregard these real impediments to conduct which are bad. If they're going to disregard the real impediments, aren't they going to disregard the fables of punishment hereafter even more? So he continues, and so with regard to righteousness, our doctrine, Epicurean philosophy, neither does our doctrine do harm, nor does the opposite doctrine help. So with regard to righteousness, neither does our Epicurean doctrine do harm, nor does the other doctrine that Cicero is arguing for help. Not only does it not help, but on the other hand, it does harm. For the one removes disturbances, while the other adds them. Basically, it's the same argument whether you're talking about gods or whether you're talking about just some kind of an absolute morality. Cicero is arguing that the view of absolute morality is the thing that restrains people. And the Epicureans are saying, no, it doesn't. You see people who are not being restrained now. Let's not try to deal with them by erecting a false fantasy of a God who's going to punish them in hell. Let's deal with them here and now in reality. And the only way that you can deal with people who are doing bad things is to make sure that they are punished or restrained and therefore cannot continue to do those bad things.
Yeah, Cassius, there are several classes of people and ideas that we can talk about here. Shakespeare in Richard III gives us an example of a person who sort of mines the resources of religion and virtue in order to cloak his evil deeds. He says here, this is Richard III speaking, "And thus I clothe my naked villainy with odd old ends, stolen out of holy writ, and seem a saint when most I play the devil." Richard III had or was in the process of killing all his brothers and nephews and basically cutting down everyone that stood between him and the throne. But of course, he was doing this not in the open light of day, but using subterfuge as his method, just in order to become king. But there's an example also. The irony is I still see this one used, presumably ironically. There's this phrase from medieval Latin. It goes like this: Caedite eos, novit enim dominus qui sunt eus. And according to Wikipedia, this is a phrase reportedly spoken by the commander of the Albigensian Crusade prior to the massacre at Béziers on 22 July 1209. Direct translation of the medieval Latin phrase is, "Kill them. The Lord knows those that are his own." Papal legate and Cistercian abbot Arnaud Almeric was the military commander of the crusade in its initial phase and leader of this first major military action of the crusade, and was reported by Caesarius of Heisterbach to have uttered the order, "Kill them all, let God sort them out," is the phrase that this is given rise to. And there are Old and New Testament quotes to justify precisely that position. And so we come to the part here now where we have to push this even further, because Cassius, as you just quoted, what was the part about conceding in there?
So it's obvious that wrongdoers, given that they do not fear the penalties imposed by the law, are not afraid of the gods. This has to be conceded, for if they were afraid, they would not do wrong.
Right. We do have to concede that position, but we also should make the case that even people who take sincerely the idea that the gods exist, even people who are driven all their lives by religious feeling and by moral and virtuous thinking, are very easily led astray. And it's all the worse in their case, because the person, generally speaking, who commits crimes out of opportunity or vanity or pleasure seeking is going to be less bad most times than the person who commits crimes as a real, genuine, true believer who thinks that what they're doing is not only not wrong, that what they're doing is the only right and just and moral and virtuous thing to do under the circumstance. Kill them all. God will sort out his own. That is an expression of a feeling of, I am a servant of pure, absolute, perfect morality because it comes from a pure, absolute, and perfect God. I am his right arm today, and I am going to make the decision here as to who lives and who dies because I have the authority granted to me by a figure that is beyond reproach. How could you possibly gainsay such a person who props himself up in this way? Except by saying that, no, your authority, it does not exist in that way. You're wrong to think that this is the power that has been granted to you. You're wrong to think that this is moral or virtuous. You're wrong to think that this is just. As you quoted there, Epicureanism will allow people who are so minded as a guise to commit crimes or injustices or immoral acts and get away with them. That's probably true. But the other side has not only the same problem, right, that people will use virtue as a guise to cover up their evil, as I quoted from Richard III here, even though he wouldn't have praised virtue earnestly. But people do that. People do praise virtue and morality in earnest and go on to commit the most heinous crimes, which it's possible to imagine.
Yes, exactly. I think we're really beginning to bring this part into focus here. Even though it gets intricate to go back and forth comparing the two options, we've seen the example of it at the beginning of Lucretius. This is basically the same thing as saying, so great is the power of religion to persuade people to evil deeds. You could say exactly the same thing about this view of absolute morality that Cicero is advocating. So great is the power of this virtue to persuade people to evil deeds. In the example you gave of kill them all, let God sort them out. It's that kind of total, absolute abandonment of discretion and intelligent evaluation of the justice of a situation that you can arrive at, whether you're talking about some god telling you to sacrifice your daughter like Ephinesa, or whether you're talking about some kind of a military action, as in the example that you gave. Cicero is not solving the problem by pointing out that people do bad things, and so you need something else to stop them. Your something else that you're trying to add, Cicero, is non-existent. And when you assert something non-existent and in the end ridiculous as a guideline, you're undermining any rational guideline that may exist in fact. Seems to me to be what Diogenes of Oinoander is saying here when he says that the opposite doctrine does not only not help, but it does harm. What about the harm of undermining honesty and clear thinking and reality by asserting that this absolute morality or this law from heaven exists when it clearly does not, when there is no way to prove that it exists and there's no evidence for it? In fact, all the evidence is against it. You are not just simply creating a fairy tale that does no harm. You're absolutely undermining any confidence that the people you're dealing with should find you to be honest and just. Now, continuing on in section 17, the example that Cicero gives to drive this point home even further, apparently it was a big problem in the Roman world, and it remains a problem today, I guess, to make sure that wills and testamentary instructions when you die are carried out. And the Romans apparently had something called a Voconian law. The Voconian law was apparently some kind of a restriction in bequeathing your property to a female heir. And so what the Romans would do to get around this Voconian law would be to leave the property to an executor with instructions to the executor to then transfer the property on to the female heir. And the example given here is that of Publius Sextilius Rufus, who was made an executor of Quintus Fadius Gallus. Gallus had requested that the whole property passed to the daughter. And so the dilemma is this. Well, if you're a Roman citizen, you're not going to lie and you're not going to evade the law. So what do you do when you've been asked to be the intermediary to evade the law? What do you do when your friend has left his property to you with the understanding you're going to give it to your friend's daughter, but that would violate the law? Cicero's example here says that in this case, what an executor did was he kept the estate for himself, because if he had carried out the wishes, he would have been in violation of the law. So Cicero says, Sextilius kept a very large property, of which he would never have touched a single penny if he accepted the tenets of those who set morality and uprightness above all gains and advantages. Well, do you suppose that his mind was troubled or disturbed? Nothing less could be true. On the contrary, he was enriched by the property, and this made him glad. He placed a high value on money gained, not merely without breach of the laws, but actually by observance of the laws. So here's another example of a dilemma that Cicero says where you should choose morality and virtue over your own advantage.
As I read through this, Cassius, once again, I'm struck by the absence in Cicero of any consideration that virtue or justice have a role to play in Epicurean philosophy. Epicurus does not make virtue to be the good or the goal. He does not make virtue out to be the telos, as these other philosophers do. And it's true that that position is only occupied by pleasure. Pleasure is the good. It is the end, the guide. But virtue is, as we sometimes say, a handmaiden to pleasure. It guides us in the pursuit of pleasure. It guides us in the avoidance of pain. Just like reason, which is not canonic, but is nevertheless an indispensable mental faculty, guides us in the pursuit of pleasure. Just like a distaste for pain guides us in the pursuit of pleasure. All of these things have to be weighed and balanced, but Cicero doesn't allow Epicurus the level of nuance that would be required to give the full exposition of his position on this subject. He does him very dirty here on the issue of justice by leaving out Epicurus's very reasonable foundation for covenants and laws.
Torquatus has made very clear already how highly Epicurus had valued your reputation, your status in the community, the position you hold with your friends. Here we have now 2,000 years of this Roman who has been held up to disrepute for having basically stolen this inheritance. And Cicero's ignoring the fact that Cicero himself is using the disrepute against him. And he's ignoring that Epicurus has said exactly the same thing. That when Torquatus's ancestors had done the things that they did in wars, they did it because it brought the esteem of the community and the appreciation of the community for having done those things. Well, this man may have been glad that he stole the inheritance, and maybe he wasn't punished by the law, but he would have suffered the same fall in reputation within his community that we're talking about here. And once he became known for having done this, there were ramifications in his life before he died that were negative on him for having gone against his word to his friend. So Cicero just continues to ignore that Epicurus does have this mechanism. When you do bad things are going to happen to you. They may not be immediate, they may not be as dramatic in terms of punishment as we would like to see them, but they're still there. And even when the punishment doesn't come with as much force as we would like to see it, the ramifications of these actions are real, and an appeal to absolute morality is not real. An appeal to a God who's going to punish you in hell after death is not real. At least while we may not get the satisfaction in terms of punishment against a bad person we'd like to see, we're not resorting to a made-up fantasy as an excuse.
We're also not answerable to his crime. Cicero is like taking all of the horrible things that these well-known Greek and Roman scoundrels have done over the years, and he's just laying them all at the feet of Epicurus and saying that this is your work. This is what you've done to the world. You have created a philosophy that licenses every single one of these crimes. And that couldn't, in my view, be more ludicrous or more arbitrary, meretricious. I mean, it's absolutely foolish and ridiculous that Cicero is doing this. But this is his approach here. It occurred to me that in the whole first half of this book, too, Cicero kept chipping away at pleasure. He's like, I don't want pleasure to mean absence of pain. I don't want pleasure to mean mental pleasure. I don't want pleasure to mean the remembrance of past pleasures or the anticipation of future pleasures. Pleasure is only stimulation. So he was constantly throughout the first half of this book trying to cut down the meaning of the word pleasure to only mean the pleasures of the profligate or the pleasures of the sybarite. And it seems to me that in the second half here, his operation when it comes to the Epicurean understanding of justice or morality is kind of similar. He doesn't allow a fuller exposition of justice in the same way that he didn't want to hear a fuller exposition of pleasure.
That's right. He's ignoring the fact that if these people who he's citing as examples of bad conduct, if they had in fact applied Epicurus's philosophy, if they had in fact given thought to the wider ramifications of what they were doing, in all likelihood, they would not have done these things in the first place. As you were saying, Joshua, he's accusing these people of being Epicureans when they're not being Epicureans at all because they're not looking at all of the ramifications of their conduct. Cicero takes this a little bit further in an interesting way that we ought to make sure we don't skip over. In talking about these people who have gained money improperly, Tubulus from stealing from the country, and this last situation where the executor of the will stole from the proper person who should have inherited, he's talking about people who are gaining money unjustly. And he now wants to lump Epicureans as being particularly susceptible to this idea of going after money. And in referring to the person who's stolen the inheritance, he said, that person placed a high value on money gained not merely without breach of the laws, but actually by observance of the laws. And money, your school, the Epicureans, must get in spite of risks because it is productive of many and great pleasures. Thus is the men who lay down that everything upright and moral is desirable for its own sake must often face dangers in the interest of seemliness and morality. So your friends who measure everything by the standard of pleasure must face dangers in order to make themselves masters of great pleasures. If great wealth or great property is at stake, seeing that money purchases very many pleasures, Epicurus must, if he desires to carry out his own view of the ultimate good, act in the same manner as Scipio, who saw great fame in store for him if he succeeded in drawing back Hannibal into Africa. Therefore, how great was the danger that he, Hannibal, faced? In this entire enterprise of his, he was guided by morality and not by pleasure. But your wise man, when urged on by some great gain, will do battle for money's sake if occasion requires. Perhaps it may have been possible for a crime to remain concealed. He'll be delighted. If caught, he'll make light of all punishments, since he'll be trained to think lightly of death and banishment and even pain itself. You and your friends represent pain as intolerable when you set punishment before the eyes of unprincipled men, but as endurable when you make out that the wise man has always a preponderance of good. So it's an interesting play on principal doctrines 4 in terms of pain, because he's citing that doctrine that an Epicurean is going to be strong against pain because he knows that pain is short if strong and endurable if long. And he's saying, Epicurus, you're training your people to withstand punishment. You're trying to tell me, Epicurus, that the pain of punishment is the reason why bad people should not do bad things. But you're training your people that pain is tolerable, that pain is avoidable and endurable. You're training your people to get out of the very punishment that you're saying keeps people doing the things that they should be doing, which is kind of an interesting twist on attacking Epicurus there. He's saying that you Epicureans are disposed to pursue money without restraint. And it's useless for you, Epicurus, to say that punishment is going to restrain people from pursuing money improperly, because you're teaching people that pain is endurable. So you're taking away the restriction that prevents you Epicureans from being just total money grubbers. So you've got two things going on here. He's accusing Epicureans of being particularly disposed towards the pursuit of money at all costs. And he's saying not only are they pursuing money at all costs, they're not even concerned about the punishment for getting caught for stealing money, because they know that pain is endurable if long and short if harsh.
Yeah, it's a very interesting argument. Now, in Horace, in his epistles, this is Epistle 6 in his first book, he says, if your lungs or kidneys were attacked by cruel disease, you'd seek relief from the disease. You wish to live well. Who does not? If it's virtue alone achieves it, then be resolute, forego pleasure. But if you consider virtue is only words, and a forest is only firewood, then beware lest your rivals first to dock, lest you lose Sybara's or Bithynia's trade, cleared 1,000 and another, then add a third pile, rounded off with a fourth. Surely, wife and dowry, loyalty and friends, birth and beauty too are the gifts of Her Highness Cash, while Venus and charm grace the moneyed classes. Don't be like Cappadocia's king, rich in slaves, short of lucre. They say Lucullus was asked if he could lend the theater 100 Greek cloaks. Who could find all those, he answered, but I'll see and send what I've got. Later, a note. It seems at home I've 5,000. Take any of them. Take the lot. It's a poor house where there isn't much to spare. Much that evades the master benefits his slaves. If wealth alone will make you happy and keep you so, be first to strive for it again and last to leave off. It shouldn't be surprising when we read this to see how far this deviates from what Epicurus had to say about the pursuit of wealth and fame, which he said, first of all, makes you a slave to the crowds. But this bit about, I think in the Latin, last time I looked into this, when he says, if you think a forest only firewood, I think that's a reference to like a sacred grove, right? A grove sacred to some god. Other people would be worshiping in this grove, but you come by with your 100 men with axes and just chop it all down for money, is the illusion there. And the reference to virtue being only words, that might be a reference to the last words of Brutus, Cassius, which you quote occasionally, that, oh, virtue, I thought you were something real, but it turned out you were only words after all. It seems likely to me here that Horace has his tongue planted firmly in cheek, and that if it is the Epicureans he has in mind, certainly Epicurus's advice was not to pile cash upon cash upon cash without any view to either the pain that you caused yourself or the harm that you caused to others. It's true that money brings pleasure, but you moderate that against all of the auxiliary details that you could find in all of his ethical philosophy.
Yes, absolutely. He's just ignoring time after time after time the things that Epicurus has clearly said that are right in front of him in these core Epicurean texts. And he is distorting by selectively isolating certain aspects of the doctrine and keeping it separate from how it all fits together. Because in the end, it all fits together as a result of the actions that the person is pursuing. The examples that we've been talking about today and that we'll continue as we move forward next week into the end of section 17 and into 18, they all can be brought into focus by this question of what is the reality of the situation? The reality of the situation is that everyone as an individual can look at the actions of other people and see them doing things that they consider to be bad, consider to be harmful to themselves or to others. And how are you going to analyze this question of the fact that people don't always do what you want them to do? Are you going to say that there is an absolute morality and that your version of what's right and wrong applies to everyone? Are you going to look for some kind of a mechanism to erect your own code of values as absolute? Are you going to say that there's a morality out there in the world, a virtue, and that you're in tune with it? And you may be in tune with it through reason and logic, or you may be in tune with it through God telling you so. But from whatever perspective you look at it, are you going to indulge yourself in the fiction that there is an absolute right and wrong that other people are sometimes violating? And are you going to try to stop them from doing the things that you consider to be bad by quoting them this absolute morality handed down from some authority and think that that's going to help the situation? Or are you going to look at the reality of the world from an Epicurean's perspective, that there is no supernatural God, there is no overriding absolute code of right and wrong, and all that nature's given you or anybody else is pleasure and pain, And are you then going to work with the reality of pleasure and pain to come up with a culture, with a set of laws, a set of social norms that do lead to generally the best result? Which of those two paths are you going to choose? When you've got a hard set of facts that you don't like, are you going to erect a fiction, a false narrative, a story? And as we're recording this, it's probably appropriate that we're recording this on Christmas Eve 2023. The central story of much of the world to resolve some of these questions is to look for a supernatural answer to the problems of life. And that's certainly one course that many people choose to follow. Epicurus suggested that it's not only not helpful to do that, but it's actually harmful to your successful living to erect these stories that are not based on truth and reality. But if you do, in fact, choose to look at the reality of nature and see how nature gives us pleasure and pain, you can, if you intelligently approach life and nature, erect a system that will allow a generally better result than if you erect a system based on falsehoods. One more quotation from Diogenes of Oinoander, where he says this: "We come to this question, was it, may I ask, for his own sake that God created the world, or for the sake of human beings? For it's obvious that it was from a wish to benefit either himself or human beings that he embarked on this undertaking. For how could it have been otherwise if nothing is produced without a cause, and these things are produced by God? Let us then examine this view and what the Stoics mean. It was, they say, from a wish to have a city and fellow citizens, just as if he were an exile from a city, that the God created the world and human beings. However, this supposition, a concoction of empty talking, is self-evidently a fable composed to gain the attention of an audience, not a natural philosopher's argument searching for the truth and inferring from probabilities things not palpable to sense." So in Diogenes of Oinoander's words, what you want to avoid is a supposition, a concoction of empty talking, something that's self-evidently a fable and composed to gain the attention of an audience, not a natural philosopher's pursuit of truth and the inference from probabilities and things that are brought to us through the senses and the faculties that nature has given to us. So that's the difference between Epicurus's approach and this conventional absolute morality, supernatural religion approach. Epicurus is suggesting that the search for truth and probabilities brought forth from the senses will lead you in his direction and not to this direction that Cicero is advocating. We'll come back next week and we'll turn to a discussion of the next of Cicero's tweaks to the question. He started out by saying, well, what if he's not found out? If your evil man is not found out, then he can do anything he wants to and he'll never be punished. And so you're ridiculous to suggest that that's a restraint on conduct. That was Cicero's tweak for today. The next week it will be, well, what if your bad man is in fact all powerful? What if he in fact has the power to not be punished and to evade the things that we call punishment? Isn't that going to be a terrible result as well, and that your philosophy doesn't take account of? And I think Epicureans would answer it the same way, that bad things do happen sometimes, but we're not going to abandon the way things are. We're not going to abandon what nature has given to us. We're going to stick to that and do the best we can with what nature has provided. Okay, let's begin to come to a conclusion today and talk about final comments. Martin, do you have any comments on what we discussed today?
No, sorry. Again, I have no comments.
All right, thank you, Martin. Joshua.
Yes, Cassius. I want to pick up with what you were just talking about there. And I want to add to that a quote from this letter that was written in the 15th century by Cosmo Raimondi, a letter that I learned about from you. Cosmo Raimondi, who was born in about the year 1400 and died in 1435 or 1436, was a native of Cremona and a pupil of Gasparino Barziza, 1360 to 1431. He helped to decipher an important manuscript of Cicero's rhetorical works and wrote a well-known defense of Epicurus, a letter to Ambrogio Tignosi in defense of Epicurus against the Stoics, academics, and peripatetics in 1429. And in that letter, he writes, "We see that man's whole constitution is geared towards the perception of pleasure, that nature carries us towards it, that a great many important things exist for its sake, that all our actions are measured against its standard, so that in the end lives may be free of care. In short, that everything is desired purely on account of pleasure it will give us. In these circumstances, now that Epicurus's case is conclusively proved by these rigorous and convincing arguments, who could be still so hostile to him as not to assent to his doctrine and admit that the highest felicity will be found in pleasure? But the Peripatetics do deny his doctrine and cannot bear the thought that pleasure is the supreme good, placing it rather in virtue. I should like to ask them, if virtue itself is going to bring in its train sadness, grief, pain, and fear, is it still to be desired? That I think they will not agree to. Since then, virtue is sought for the tranquility it brings to life, in which, under the name of pleasure, Epicurus identifies the supreme good. Again, I ask the Peripatetics why they are unwilling to place the greatest good in pleasure. If, perhaps, some think that by this Epicurus meant that we should spend our days wallowing in feasting and drinking, in gambling, games, and the pleasures of sex, such a wastrel Epicurus would hardly deserve our praise. His teaching would indeed be lamentable if he wanted us to be gluttonous, drunken, debauched, boastful, and promiscuous. But that is not what Epicurus in his wisdom said or recommended. In fact, so far was he from wanting us to live without virtue, that virtue is actually essential for living up to his teaching, since it constrains and directs, as it were, all the bodily senses and does not permit us to make use of them except when needed. Epicurus does not slide into pleasure in the manner of animals without the exercise of judgment and when necessity does not require it, but rather enjoys it with restraint when it is right to do so. His theories, therefore, should not be neglected, nor should they be treated as condemned. And it is clear that the Peripatetics have not sufficiently understood what it is that they are saying. And in that old academy tradition, we include Cicero, who has not sufficiently understood what it is that he is saying here. That letter is excellent to read and always worth looking at again, but bears directly on the question. Cicero is asking here, what are you going to do, Epicurus? What are you going to do about corrupt officials? What are you going to do about kings who behave barbarically? And it's like, what do you want him to do, Cicero? Do you want him to mete out punishment like a god? All we can do in these situations is erect laws based on covenants, not to harm nor to be harmed, and to build our lives and our societies in such a way as to detect these crimes when they are committed and punish them when the perpetrators are caught. That's it. That's all we can do. It's not possible to build a system of ethical or moral philosophy in which nobody ever again commits any crimes. It would be ludicrous to imagine that we could possibly achieve that. And so Epicurus isn't going to fall back on, like you were saying, Cassius, this imaginary understanding of absolute morality. He's not going to fall back on the idea that there is an all-powerful God intervening in the affairs of men to keep things on a moral level. Those are not true. Even if they were good, we wouldn't pursue them because they're not true.
Yes, Joshua. In fact, this calls to my mind, we've been discussing on the forum in the last couple of days. You know, it's very easy to become almost nihilistic, to become discouraged at what we see going on around us. We know what a mess men make of everything, and to go from that observation to think that, well, nothing makes any difference and that we should just give up, or that we should abandon ourselves to ideas that have no foundation and to fantasies and to noble lies as if that's the best we can do. But that's not the alternative that Epicurus was suggesting. And in the discussion for this week, I was pointing out a section of what Frances Wright had Epicurus say in confronting the Stoics in her A Few Days in Athens. And I think that's where we're going here. Epicurus can't wave a magic wand over the world and change things that we think are bad. As you said a moment ago, he's not a supernatural God. He's not a set of ideal abstractions. And he's not going to suggest to you that there are, because those things just don't exist. But does that mean that you're going to give up what you can do to try to make a better place to live in, to try to make a better world for yourself and your friends? You're not going to just give up and walk away from the challenge of doing what you can. You're going to take what nature has given you and articulate it in a constructive and persuasive way so that people can live more successfully. Here's something that Francis Wright, as Epicurus said, some few generations when the amiable virtues of Epicurus and the sublime excellence of Zeno shall no longer live in remembrance or tradition, the fierce and ambitious bigots of some new sect may alike calumniate both, proclaim the one for a libertine and the other for a hypocrite. But I will allow that I, Epicurus, am more open to detraction than Zeno, that while your school shall be abandoned, mine shall more probably be disgraced. But it will be the same cause that produces the two effects. It will be equally the degeneracy of man that shall cause the discarding of your doctrines and the perversion of mine. Why then should the prospect of the future disturb Epicurus more than Zeno? The fault will not lie with me any more than with you, but with the vices of my followers and the ignorance of my judges. I follow my course, guided by what I believe to be wisdom, with the good of man at my heart, adapting my advice to his situation, his disposition, and his capacities. My efforts may be unsuccessful, my intentions may be calumniated, but as I know these to be benevolent, so I shall continue those, unterrified and unruffled by reproaches, unchilled by occasional ingratitude and frequent disappointment. And that's what we see when we look at people who do bad things who are not punished. We do have frequent disappointment that the world does not bring a perfect result to everyone in every situation. But we're not going to abandon reality. We're going to go forward in a benevolent and a wise manner with the faculties that nature has given to us. And we're going to do the best we can under the circumstances. We're not going to come up with a fantasy. We're going to do the best that we can with reality. So I think a lot of this gets wrapped up into that aspect of the question. And I think that Epicurus not only has a very defensible position, but he has a stronger position than does Cicero. And he erects his morality that does lead to a better result on a much stronger foundation than Cicero and Plato and Aristotle and the rest of them ever dreamed of doing. So, okay, again, it's Christmas Eve. Thank you again this year for those who have listened to our podcast. We appreciate those who drop by the forum and talk with us about the things that we discuss here. We invite you to join us there each week and every week to discuss Epicurean philosophy. Thank you for your time this week. We'll be back soon. See you then.